This presentation is going to look at the use of fiscal policy during a depression. This is called Keynesian demand management because these principles of how to deal with a depression and how a government should spend and borrow during a depression were put forward by the Cambridge economist John Maynard Keynes in the 1930s. So we've seen that the economy usually cycles. It has up phases and down phases, and it cycles around its potential. The potential GDP is the ability of the economy to produce at any one time. So the potential of the economy to produce is usually going up over time because technology gets better, we accumulate more capital in the economy, and our workers become more productive because they become better educated. So, although the potential GDP of the economy is rising, the actual GDP of the economy, the actual GDP, can be above its potential or below its potential at any one time. We want to consider a situation such as point A. Here, the economy has gone into a depression. GDP has been falling for some time, and the GDP is now very much below its potential. So there is what we call a very large negative output gap. That is to say, actual GDP is very much below potential GDP. So we can say that the economy is in a depression. This is exactly what happened between around 1929 and 1933, a period known as the Great Depression, which started in the USA but spread to Europe. And this was marked by very low output in the American and European economies and very high levels of unemployment. This period of the Great Depression was when John Maynard Keynes formulated his theories of demand management, which became known as Keynesian demand management. Before Keynes came the so-called classical economists. They believed that if GDP became very, very low and unemployment very high, that wages of workers would automatically fall and fall quite quickly. As wages fell, firms, they assumed, would begin to hire workers again, and unemployment would drop and output would start to rise. In other words, the classical economists assumed that recessions and depressions would correct themselves fairly quickly through a fall in wages. However, Keynes did not believe this. He showed that wages would not necessarily decrease even in a depression when there was a huge negative output gap and unemployment was very high. He showed that this meant that the negative output gap could in fact continue for a very long time without correcting itself. So Keynes recommended that when the economy reached a very low level of output and when the output gap was extremely large and negative, he recommended that governments should intervene. He recommended that government borrowing should increase and spending should increase rapidly and dramatically. According to Keynes, this was the only thing that would stimulate aggregate demand, increase output, and reduce unemployment. So rather than waiting for things to correct themselves, rather than waiting for the output gap to automatically become less through falling wages, Keynes recommended active action by the government. He said that government borrowing and spending should be massively increased in order to boost aggregate demand, increase output, and reduce unemployment. He also said that as output and income rose, tax revenues would eventually rise, so the government would be collecting more taxes, and with this extra tax money, they could repay the borrowing that they had to do in order to increase their spending. So for Keynes, there was no real long-term danger in the government borrowing massively during a depression. He felt that this borrowing could easily be repaid with increased tax revenues after the government spending had had its effect and output in the economy had started to rise again. So these policies of Keynesian demand management were put forward and explained by Keynes, and in fact they depended a lot on the so-called multiplier effect. Keynes was convinced that as the government increased its spending, there would be a multiplier effect in the economy, which meant that GDP would rise, but more than proportionally in relationship to government spending. So for every pound that the government spent, the GDP would rise by much more than £1. So therefore, in Keynes's theory, government borrowing would not really have to be so big, because they would not have to borrow a lot of money in order to increase the GDP of the country. And that is because the multiplier effect would be working in favor of the government. Now, so far the presentations haven't really fully explained or even partially explained the aggregate demand, aggregate supply model and the graphs that go with this model. But as we have been discussing Keynesian demand management, it's just as well to show how we would illustrate this on a graph of aggregate demand and aggregate supply. What we can see is that if we start with an aggregate demand curve which is well shifted to the left, leading to an equilibrium level of output at Y0, which is extremely low, this is when the economy is in a depression. Keynes recommended that at this time, governments should borrow and spend more money. This autonomous level of spending would shift the aggregate demand curve to the right and cause it to intersect with the aggregate supply curve at a far higher level of real output. So on a graph, on an aggregate supply, aggregate demand graph, what we are seeing is that Keynesian demand management policies would shift the AD curve to the right and cause the real output of the economy to rise within a relatively short period of time, and that this would mean reduced unemployment. Now, in the financial crisis of 2007-2008, when banks went bankrupt in the UK, Europe, and in the USA, this was followed by a prolonged recession in both the USA and the UK. In both countries, GDP fell well below its potential, and we seem to be in a Keynesian depression situation. In fact, Keynesian demand management policies were put into action in 2008. And the results were that government borrowing went up massively in both the US and the UK, and government spending also increased, just as Keynes recommended. In the UK, the recession lasted 2 years, which is a relatively short period of time, given the severity and seriousness of the financial crisis. And many have pointed to this and said that this shows that Keynesian demand management policies did work when they were tried so vigorously from 2008 onwards. However, despite the massive increase in government spending after 2008 and, of course, government borrowing, the UK GDP, the UK economy, has only grown very, very slowly from 2011 until the present. The national debt, which grew to over £1 trillion during the period of government borrowing after the financial crisis, is still incredibly high. And so, we may doubt whether Keynesian demand management policies still work. Some evidence suggests that they do, and some evidence suggests that perhaps the demand management policies recommended by Keynes may not be as effective today, even in a depression, as they were in the 1930s. We will simply have to wait and see. And in fact, there's no way of really proving whether Keynes still works, because now that we've tried Keynesian demand management and seen the result, we can't go back in time and see what the economy would have done if we hadn't borrowed money, if the government hadn't borrowed money and spent it in such massive amounts. So, like with any economic policy, it's irreversible, and history does not allow us to look back and see how different things could have been if we had done things differently. So I suppose the evidence will always remain unclear. But the recession in the UK was remarkably short, given the massive financial crisis that came before it. And so we can say with some degree of certainty that Keynesian demand management policies did work at least partially when they were tried after 2008.